Hey everyone, welcome back. Today, forgiving ourselves. It's something I think we all struggle with, right?
Yeah,
Uh,
absolutely.
we're gonna really try to dig deep into this. We've got this podcast called Why is Forgiving Yourself So Hard? It's all about like finding that true inner freedom. And I've got to say, I was thinking about this
Hmm.
just the other day. It's kind of like, when you spill coffee on yourself
Oh, yeah.
right before a big meeting?
Ugh, the worst.
You've changed your clothes, but you still feel that like sticky residue.
Yeah, it's like that.
That's what it feels like to hold on to guilt.
It's so true. It's funny, though, because we're often so quick to forgive others.
Right.
But when it comes to ourselves, it's like a whole different story.
It is. And this podcast we're looking at, it actually dives into the psychology of why that is.
Fascinating stuff.
So why is it so much harder to forgive ourselves? Shouldn't we be like our own biggest cheerleaders?
Well, we all have that inner critic,
Oh, yeah.
that voice in our head, always pointing out every little flaw.
Mine's brutal.
Right. And the source points out that this inner critic, it's often shaped by, our past experiences, all those messages we get about what we should be doing or who we should be.
Oh, for sure. Like all the societal pressures.
Exactly.
Yeah. So we end up kind of turning all that judgment inward.
It's like we set these impossible standards for ourselves.
And then we beat ourselves up when we don't meet them, which, like, we never will.
Exactly. It's like trying to, I don't know, run a marathon with a backpack full of rocks.
Oh, I like that. That's good.
You might make some progress, but man, it's going to be painful.
That's a great analogy. Okay, so we've got this inner critic making it super hard to forgive ourselves.
Yeah.
But then the source brings in this whole perspective from the Bible, and it really got me thinking.
Oh, yeah. What part?
It's this idea that maybe we're not the ones who are supposed to be judging ourselves in the first place.
Interesting. That makes sense, though, right?
Right. Like there's this verse in Psalms, it's Psalm 75.8. It says, "But it is God who judges. He puts down one, he raises up another." It's like, whoa, maybe we need to step down from the judge's bench here.
It's funny because there's this other verse, it's James 4.1,
Okay.
and it talks about how we shouldn't judge others because that's basically trying to take on God's role.
So like if we shouldn't be judging other people,
Right.
shouldn't that also apply to ourselves?
Exactly. Have you ever thought about that? Like, how often do we put on that judge's robe and condemn ourselves for stuff?
Yeah. That's a really good point. It's like instead of focusing on the condemnation,
Yeah.
maybe we should be focusing on understanding and, growing from our experiences.
Absolutely. And that kind of leads us to what the source talks about next, which is this idea of, well, if God forgives us.
Right. God who sees everything.
Right.
Then who are we to hold on to all this guilt?
It's radical, isn't it?
It is.
And to drive that point home, they bring in John 3.17. It says, "For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him."
So it's like God isn't all about condemnation. He's
Right.
all about love and second chances.
Redemption, yeah.
Yeah.
It's like that condemnation we feel, all that self-criticism.
Yeah.
That's not from God. That's the enemy trying to keep us trapped.
Oh, wow. So if God, with all his knowledge and wisdom, chooses to forgive us,
Yeah.
then maybe, just maybe, we can start to forgive ourselves too.
It all comes down to recognizing that God's grace is bigger than any mistake we could ever make.
That is so powerful. Okay, so we're not the ultimate judge. God offers forgiveness freely, and maybe we should stop trying to be perfect and embrace this grace.
Right.
But how? How do we actually do that? How do we take all this and put it into practice?
Great question.
Mhm.
That's where the source gets really practical. It lays out some steps that we can take to start forgiving ourselves.
Okay, because let's be real. Knowing that we should forgive ourselves and actually doing it, that's a whole other thing.
Two very different things.
Yeah.
It's a process. It takes effort.
Right.
But the good news is there are things we can do to make it a little easier.
I am so ready to hear about these steps. This is already giving me a whole new perspective.
Good. I'm glad to hear that. And that's really what it's all about, helping you see things in a new light.
Okay, so let's dive into those practical steps after a quick break.
Sounds good. All right. So the source lays out these steps for, actually forgiving ourselves.
Okay, yeah.
And the first one is all about acknowledging our humanity.
Okay, that makes sense as a starting point, but what does that actually look like?
Well, it means recognizing that we're not perfect. We're going to mess up, make mistakes. Sometimes we totally fall flat on our faces.
Yeah, I guess it's easy to forget that when you're constantly seeing, like, these perfect lives on social media and stuff.
Oh, yeah, for sure. We start comparing ourselves to these unrealistic ideals. and then we end up feeling like we're not good enough.
Right, right.
The Source actually uses this great analogy. They compare our mistakes to stumbling along a path. We're all going to trip up every now and then, but it's about getting back up, dusting ourselves off, and continuing on the journey.
I like that. It takes the pressure off. It's like,
Yeah,
okay, I messed up, but it doesn't mean I'm a complete failure. It just means I'm human.
exactly. And that leads us to the next step, which is seeking forgiveness from God and from others.
Ooh, yeah, that can be tough.
It can be, but it's so important for, letting go of that guilt and shame we carry around.
It's like we get stuck in the cycle of punishing ourselves. Like we don't deserve to move on until we've suffered enough.
Right, exactly.
But the source makes this point that holding on to that guilt, it doesn't actually help anyone.
It just keeps us stuck.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like we're imprisoning ourselves,
Yeah.
And while, yeah, it's important to acknowledge the impact of our actions, to make amends if we can,
Right.
clinging to that guilt doesn't actually undo the past.
It just prevents us from actually growing and moving on in a healthy way.
Exactly. Which brings us to the power of affirmations.
Okay, affirmations. You mentioned earlier how my inner critic can be brutal.
Oh, yeah.
So tell me more about how affirmations play into all of this.
Think of them as like a secret weapon against that negativity. You're basically replacing those negative thoughts with positive statements.
Hmm,
The Source has this really simple one, but it's so powerful. I am forgiven. I am free.
I like that.
And repeating affirmations like that, it can really help rewire your thinking over time.
It's like we're countering those self-condemning thoughts with, like, the truth of God's grace, right?
Yeah, exactly. It takes practice, but if you're consistent, those affirmations can start to drown out that negative self-talk.
So we've acknowledged our humanity, sought forgiveness, and started using affirmations.
Right.
What's the next step in this process?
Stop replaying the past.
Oh, man, easier said than done.
I know, right?
Well,
But the Source really emphasizes how dwelling on the past, especially things we can't change, it just keeps us stuck in this cycle of pain and regret.
it's like that saying about driving a car while looking in the rearview mirror.
Mhm.
You might avoid a few bumps, but you're going to miss out on the whole journey ahead.
Exactly. So, yeah, the past is valuable for learning and growth, but it shouldn't be our permanent residence.
So how do we break free from that? Like, how do we stop looking in that rearview mirror?
Well, it's about shifting our focus to the present moment and to the
Yeah.
future. When those thoughts about the past come up, acknowledge them, but then gently redirect your attention to what you can do right now.
Hmm. Okay, that makes sense. So we're not ignoring the past,
Right.
but we're also not letting it hold us back.
Exactly. And that leads us to that final step, trusting in God's promise.
Ah, yes. That unconditional love and forgiveness we were talking about earlier.
Mm.
It's one thing to, understand it in our heads, but it's a whole other thing to really let it sink in.
Oh, yeah, I get that. It's not easy. But that's where this verse from Isaiah comes in. Isaiah 43:25. It says, I, even I, am he who blots out your transgressions for my own sake and remembers your sins no more.
Wow, that's powerful imagery.
It is.
God doesn't just forgive us, he completely wipes the slate clean.
Like hitting the reset button.
Yeah.
That's something we can really hold on to, especially when those doubts creep in or we start feeling unworthy.
So it's not just about our own understanding of forgiveness, it's about trusting in God's unconditional love for us.
Absolutely. And that makes
Yeah.
all the difference.
Okay, so we've got these 5 steps, right?
Yeah.
Acknowledging our humanity, seeking forgiveness, using affirmations, letting go of the past, and trusting in God's promise.
It's like a roadmap to freedom from that burden of self-condemnation.
It is. And the cool thing is, all of these steps, they work together, right?
Yeah, they do. When you acknowledge your humanity, it's easier to seek forgiveness. And when you seek forgiveness, it makes it easier to start using those affirmations. And as you practice those steps, you're more likely to let go of the past and trust in God's promise.
It's like a positive feedback loop.
Exactly.
Okay, but the source also talks about how this whole self-forgiveness thing, it impacts so many different areas of our lives.
Oh, for
It's not just about how we feel about ourselves.
It affects our spiritual journey, our relationships with others, and even our mental health.
So let's unpack that a little bit. What about our spiritual journey? How does holding on to all that guilt affect that?
Well, imagine trying to have a close relationship with someone, but you're convinced that they secretly despise you.
Okay, yeah.
It's going to create distance, right? And
Yeah.
it's the same with God. If we're constantly carrying around all this guilt and shame, it's hard to fully experience his love for us.
Right. It's like we're putting up a wall between ourselves and God.
Exactly.
But when we embrace his forgiveness and extend that forgiveness to ourselves, that wall comes down.
And we can finally approach him with that confidence, knowing that we're loved and accepted no matter what.
That makes so much sense. It's like that verse about perfect love casting out fear.
Mm.
When we experience God's love fully, it really does push away all that fear of judgment.
Yeah, it gives us that freedom to connect with God on a deeper level.
Okay, so self-forgiveness impacts our relationship with God. What about our relationships with other people?
Well, you know, if we're always beating ourselves up,
Yeah.
it's hard to be kind and compassionate to others.
It's like that saying, you can't pour from an empty cup.
Exactly.
If we haven't given ourselves forgiveness, it's hard to give it to anyone else.
And it's not just about being kind. It's about being present and authentic in those relationships. When we're not carrying all that weight, we can show up more fully for the people we care about.
So self-forgiveness is like this ripple effect. It
Mhm.
starts with us, but it impacts everyone around us.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then, of course, there's the impact on our mental health.
Oh, for sure. I know that for me, holding on to resentment, whether it's towards myself or someone else, it just weighs me down.
It makes sense. Carrying that burden of unforgiveness, it takes a toll on us emotionally, mentally.
Yeah.
It can lead to anxiety, depression, all sorts of things.
It's like that toxic cloud we were talking about earlier. It just follows you everywhere.
But the beautiful thing about self-forgiveness is that it helps us release all that toxicity.
Okay.
It's not about condoning our mistakes or pretending they didn't happen.
Right.
It's about acknowledging them, learning from them, and then choosing to move forward with grace.
It's about finding that peace again.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a gift worth fighting for.
So self-forgiveness is about way more than just feeling good about ourselves.
Hmm.
It's about transforming our relationships, our connection with God, and even our overall well-being.
It's about stepping into a life of freedom and wholeness.
It's amazing, isn't it, how self-forgiveness touches every part of our lives.
It really is.
This whole conversation, it's been so eye-opening.
Good, I'm glad.
It's like I'm finally giving myself permission to, be kind to myself,
Yeah.
to embrace that grace we've been talking about.
It's a journey we're all on, this whole learning to forgive ourselves thing.
It's not always easy.
Oh, absolutely not. Like some days I feel like I'm making progress,
Yeah.
and then other days it's like I'm right back where I started.
And you know what? That's okay. It's a process, not a destination.
Right.
The source reminds us that even on those tough days, we can always come back to that truth.
The truth of God's forgiveness.
Exactly. His grace is bigger than any mistake we could ever make.
It's like having this safety net,
Yeah,
knowing that no matter what, we are loved and accepted.
it's a powerful reminder.
It really is. And the more we practice this self-forgiveness thing,
Yeah,
the easier it gets, right?
it does. It's like building a muscle. The more you use it, the stronger it becomes.
Oh, I like that analogy.
So it's not about, reaching this point where we never mess up again.
Right.
It's about developing that ability to bounce back, to be kind to ourselves, just like we would be to a friend.
That's so important. So as we wrap up this deep dive into self-forgiveness,
Yeah.
what's one key takeaway you hope our listeners walk away with? I think the biggest thing is that no matter what you've done, no matter how much guilt or shame you're carrying, God's forgiveness is there for you.
Mm.
And you are worthy of receiving that forgiveness,
Yeah.
both from God and from yourself. It's not about earning it. It's a gift.
That's beautiful. The source ends with this image of a wide open door, representing the freedom we find when we let go of all that self-condemnation.
Yeah, it's an invitation to step into that freedom, to embrace the future with hope.
And to remember that we don't have to carry the weight of the past anymore.
We don't.
So as we sign off today, I want to leave you with this question. What's one small step you can take today to begin forgiving yourself? Maybe it's repeating an affirmation. Maybe it's releasing a past hurt, or even just acknowledging that you're human. Whatever it is, take that step and know that you're not alone on this journey. Until next time, be kind to yourself. You deserve it.